Hey, Andrew. Thank you
Hi.
so much for joining me today. I am here with Andrew Zacks, and he is one of the partners in, say your firm's name again.
Zacks, Freedman, and Patterson.
Okay, it's changed a few times over the years, so I've not kept track of the different partners that have been coming out, but Andrew's been doing this for about 30 years. And in San Francisco, as you guys probably know, real estate agents do a lot as opposed to New York, where there's always attorneys involved for the whole transaction. But there are certain areas where attorneys are always involved. And one of them is whenever it has to do with anything that's tenant related. We always ask our clients to consult with an attorney, and there's a lot of questions and the law is always changing. So for me, I always want to talk to an attorney and just get up to date with what's going on. And one of the new things that's been going on, and I have some rental property in San Francisco and around the United States as well, but I haven't even had a chance to fully get my head around the new regulations with regard to rent control, because at one time, well, Andrew, why don't I let you take over and say what it was and what it is now, and so that we can all understand what that means.
Sure, that's a pretty broad question, but obviously rent control was enacted in San Francisco in 1979. Originally, it was really designed for larger commercial properties, bigger buildings. It was expanded in 1994 to include owner-occupied buildings that are 4 units or less. And then it was even further expanded by state law within the last year that brings into a different scheme of rent control, separate from San Francisco, and a little more beneficial to owners, but still something people need to understand is that we now have rent control that's statewide. So then of course we have regulations that are put in place for the present emergency that were in place, which I don't really consider to be rent control. I think they're really temporary regulations that we're dealing with on top of the existing laws that are evolving literally on a daily basis. I mean, we're seeing a patchwork of local regulations in cities. We have a statewide order. We have federal regulations on top of that. And then on top of all that, we have the courts who are implementing their own special rules about whether or not landlords and property owners are going to be able to collect rent through eviction and unlawful detainer cases. And all of this is evolving incredibly quickly. And all of these questions are very much specific to particular properties. So the important thing to understand is that when you're dealing with a landlord-tenant problem or issue in San Francisco, whether in the context of a real estate transaction or not, that it's probably a good idea to talk to a lawyer.
For sure. Well, let's talk through some specific examples, because one that was not before, and I'm not 100% clear on. So like I have a single family home. Let's say I have a single family home, and I'm thinking, like right now we are having these conversations all the time where people are like, is it a good time to sell? I already bought a house in Los Altos. Could I rent that single family home for another year and then check and see how the market is doing after that? Or am I going to get myself into a situation where a year later, I ask the tenant to leave, or can I even ask the tenant to leave? How does that work?
Yeah, putting aside the temporary rules regarding the emergency.
Yes, let's put that aside.
I think we should put that aside.
Yes.
If you only own one home, and in fact, if you own less than 10 homes, and the home is in your name, your own name, and not in a corporate name, a name of a trust, like a living trust, the rules really haven't changed very much. And those rules generally are that there are no rent controls on an individual home that one person might own that they may want to sell down the road. There still are controls on evicting tenants out of that building.
As there always were, right?
As there always were.
Yeah.
However, my personal view is that without meaningful rent control that attaches to a property, eviction controls generally don't work very well. So I believe there is a very simple way to be able to rent a house for a year and then be able to have it free up for purposes of sale when the market hopefully turns for the better. So I do think that can be done. I think that that's something that people probably need to have a confidential conversation with their lawyer about, but I think it's something that can be accomplished, and it's something we have accomplished successfully in the past. And the laws really haven't, at least as of now, have not changed in a way that would change that.
Well, so just so I understand what you just said, one of the things that you said is if it was not in the name of a corporation or a living trust, but most of my clients do have their, because this would be like, it was a primary residence and then now I bought another primary residence.
Yeah.
So usually my clients do have those in some sort of living trust.
Excuse me if I misspoke. Living trusts are fine.
Okay, sorry.
It's when they're corporate owned and when the corporation owns multiple properties. So there are different rules at the state level that apply to corporations that are in the business of being landlords. So
I see.
As you may know, back in the 2009, 2010 financial meltdown, a lot of folks lost their homes, and some big corporations, venture-backed corporations, bought a lot of single-family homes throughout the country, including in California, and basically turned those into rental property, whereas before they were owner-occupied. And those particular owners are going to have to deal with statewide rent control now. Mom and pop owner who owns a single house, two houses, maybe even three houses, as long as it's not in the name of a certain type of an LLC or corporation, and even then I think they can do it. But living trusts are fine. Now, everybody owns their house in a living trust, and should, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, we're gonna have another talk on that. But so I'm clear. So I have one of the rental properties that I have, we own 3, and one of them, they're all in LLCs. So I wouldn't consider myself a professional landowner or a corporation that is dealing with this, but are they separate LLCs? We have 2 LLCs for 3 properties.
Yeah, I think you're fine. I would want to double check the rules on that, but because this is all new for us as well. But I think there is as I recall, it's 10 properties you have to own before the statewide rules kick in. So I think you're protected still. We will double check that.
So it sounds like, as far as the new rules go for this, for the statewide rent control that was enacted, and it sounds like it's pretty much the same, right? Unless you're like a really big shot landowner.
Yeah, that's correct. San Francisco has taken advantage of the new rules and has expanded eviction controls to new properties that didn't previously exist. So used to be there was a broad exemption for eviction controls for buildings that were built after 1979. Local rent control didn't attach. So after the statewide rent control law passed, San Francisco also expanded its rent and eviction controls, mostly eviction controls, to new buildings. So if you have a condo building that was built in 1990, 1995, those buildings now have eviction control where they didn't previously. But yes, the rules are basically the same for single family homes, unless you're a corporate landlord would be the way I would put it. There really have not been substantial changes. There is one ordinance that's under attack in the courts where the city is attempting to create liability for a property owner who raises the rent in a single family home. And when it's alleged that the rent was raised essentially to try and drive the tenant out. So if you gave a really large rent increase, that in my view should be perfectly fine, because if there's no rent control, there's no rent control.
Right.
But San Francisco has enacted what they call a bad faith rent increase form of wrongful eviction liability. And that's under attack in the courts. The apartment association and other groups are challenging that. I think they will ultimately succeed. I think my view is the state can't exempt you from rent control, and then the city say, well, if you raise the rent too much, that we're going to create liability for you. But that is an open question right now as to whether that can happen. If you're going to raise your rent in a single family home, you ought to be careful about how much you raise it. You don't want to raise it too much to where you could be accused of acting in bad faith.
I see. But that would be in the first example I gave, where my client bought a house in Los Altos and now they rented their single family home for a year because they're trying to wait for the market to change or whatever. The way that they would more than likely get that person, encourage that person to leave, would be by increasing the rent. That's correct. The way it's always been done, correct?
Absolutely. And the way we would typically advise a client in that situation is to put it into the lease, so that their rent automatically goes up, and they're agreeing that the rent is going to go up after a year. And of course, you can always renegotiate that when you get to the year if you want to. But I think it's a good idea that this be something the tenant actually sign off on, so they understand that they're not going to be there for a long time.
That's smart. That's smart. Then you're being very upfront about like,
Exactly. And it can never be accused of bad faith at that point because it's what the tenant agreed to. So
got it. Got it. And that brings me to the question of leases. Like, you know, a lot of clients ask me about that. Well, I'll just have a lease that'll end after a year, but like it does in San Francisco, like that doesn't mean anything, right?
it doesn't. No, because you have just cause evictions even in these single family homes. And so the fact that the tenant is a month-to-month tenant isn't a grounds to terminate the tenancy. You still need some reason, whether it's owner move-in or Ellis Act or non-payment or nuisance. There's 14 grounds under the rent ordinance that you have to fit into.
Okay. So it sounds like that's a really good tip. If I have a client and they're thinking of, you know, holding something for a temporary amount of time, they just call you, you help them write a lease, and that lease is going to stipulate that within a year or 18 months or whatever, the rent is going to go up by say $2,000 a month or something, which the client is like going in eyes wide open, and you're having the conversation like, yeah, you're probably not going to stay because I want to sell my house.
Exactly. Yeah,
So,
they understand that this is not a long-term arrangement.
Yeah.
And that if they want to stay, it's going to cost significantly more.
Right.
And you also can make it clear, and as part of your negotiation, that if people change their mind, for example, let's say the person who wants to sell their home in a year decides, you know what, maybe this isn't the right time. I want to do another year with my tenant. You can always renegotiate that amount at the time and reset it for another year. So
that's brilliant.
So yes, I am very confident in that procedure. We've used it many times, and we'd be happy to help folks who are in that situation.
I like that because it's, you know, there's nothing shady about it. Everybody understands going in, and it's super fair. So I love that.
And also you're actually not even you're not even ever having to give a rent increase. It's built into the agreement. So there's no act of the landlord that could be accused of being harassing or bad faith or somehow fraudulent, because this is all self-executing with the agreement that the tenant themselves signed.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And then, so why is it in San Francisco that some kinds of properties have rent control? And when I say rent control, I mean that, you know, in the sense that you can't ever increase the rent, right? Some, like TICs, multi-unit buildings, have that, and other ones don't.
So that's a combination of state and local law. The local ordinance, which was enacted in 1979, had a broad exemption that made it only applicable to buildings that were built before 1979. So you basically, and the purpose of that was, of course, to encourage the construction of new housing. You know, it's generally considered to be a disincentive to build rental housing if there's going to be strict regulations like rent control. So acknowledging that it would be a bad thing for the San Francisco to restrict or disincentivize the creation of new housing, the drafters of the original rent ordinance in 1979 exempted new buildings, new construction. In addition to that, there's a law called Costa-Hawkins, which I'm sure you've heard of. It's a state law. It was passed in 1995. And what Costa-Hawkins was designed to do was a number of things. It's pretty complicated and probably beyond the scope of this conversation. But for purposes of answering your question, Costa-Hawkins contains broad exemptions for single-family homes in terms of rent control, and it also contains broad exemptions for condos. There are exceptions to that also for pre-existing tenancy. So somebody lived in the building before January 1st of 1996, even though that property is exempt under state law, the tenancy of that person is grandfathered and is protected. So if you have a long-term tenant in a condo or a house, it's been there more than 25 years, and I guess it's 24 years now, those people still have protection. But most people who live in single-family homes and condos, as a result of state law, there cannot be rent control as a result of Costa-Hawkins. And this isn't a timely discussion because there is a ballot initiative that's going to be voted on in November, which seeks to roll back those protections. Guy by the name of Michael Weinstein in LA has banded together with tenant activists, and they're, for the second time in 3 years, trying to effectively repeal the Costa-Hawkins protection. It's a very important protection for property owners, and something we should all be opposing, voting against, and doing what we can to make sure it doesn't become a change in the law.
So if that is repealed, then basically, essentially what will happen is that all properties will have rent control.
No, unfortunately, it's not that simple. But let me just say that it would involve a reset of the rules that are, again, probably beyond the scope of this conversation, and hopefully we'll never have to have the conversation because hopefully it won't pass. And when they attempted to enact it 2 years ago, it failed by about 15-20%. The property owners spent a lot of money to push back on it. So we're certain there will be an active opposition. It is a less severe form of repeal. So there still are exceptions. And I think there still are exceptions for single family homes. And again, it's really designed to apply to more corporate landlords. But I haven't studied it that carefully. And because it hasn't become law, I just don't have the time to spend looking at it. But let's just say that people should be following that. And in November, there could be changes, could be further changes.
So when you say like it's not a good thing, because one of the things that I see in my everyday life is that for me, I see that there seems to be some major unintended consequences. From my perspective, it looks like rent control was put into place to protect tenants so that, as rents increase, they don't go to exorbitant prices. And then we get to have, a nice, diverse class of people living here. So we can also have, baristas and teachers and all of the important people that are right now keeping our world running. But what I see a lot of times is that people end up either keeping their places vacant whenever they move because they're worried about rent control in some cases, or they sell them because they are so worried about getting into a situation. So are there any other unintended consequences?
Ruth, first of all, let me say I 100% agree with you. The law of unintended consequences, it was basically written by the rent control laws. I mean, almost every single regulation that we have seen enacted over the 30 or 40 years of rent control, because it's 40 years now, almost every single one has had some unintended negative consequence for San Francisco. And I mean, the first one in my mind is that we've had these laws in place since 1979. The idea, of course, is to keep rents low. And we see that the housing market in San Francisco is actually one of the most expensive in the world. And the rents have continued to rise as a general matter, in part because of the unintended economic consequences of rent control, which, number one, discourage the creation of new housing. And of course, we know San Francisco has a shortage. Number two, it does encourage people to not rent their properties out and to try and change the use of rental property to other uses like TICs and condos and other forms of use. And absolutely, as laws have been ramped up, and we've had 100 or 150 changes to the law since it was first enacted, and none of them are beneficial to property owners. Every one is a more and more regulation on top of another regulation. All of those have had the effect of forcing people out of the business, making them not want to deal with the liabilities associated with being a landlord, and generally negatively affecting the rental housing market. And if you talk to 9 out of 10 economists, professionals, educators, people that are in academia, they will tell you that rent control does not work in terms of except for one thing, and that is that it keeps rents down for the people that are in possession, that are there. So if you have yours, you're protected. Now, who has theirs? What we know is that there is no means testing in rent control. So it doesn't matter whether you're Bill Gates renting from Mark Zuckerberg, right. You get protection. And that makes absolutely no sense. That makes
me so mad. I have literally had clients call me and say, oh yeah, we're making like $600,000 a year, but we're in a rent controlled apartment. And so, then they're thinking of doing really shady things like renting it to somebody else and going and buying a house. And, and then it's just like, gosh, this person who owns it, like, it's just, I don't know. It's just completely mind boggling to me.
Well, but what you're pointing out, Ruth, is that is one of the unintended consequences, which is that we now have a secondary market in the asset of a rent controlled unit.
Yeah.
And we see that every day in my office. We see people that are profiteering off of their units, that have subtenants where they don't work because they make so much money off their rent controlled unit. So it's theft at the end of the day. And so I would say that theft is one of the unintended consequences. People's hard-earned assets are being taken away from them by rules and regulations that aren't working very well.
Right, right. Yeah, I once had someone come into my open house and tell me she had like a rent controlled pied a terre. She owned a beautiful home up in Sonoma, but she had this rental apartment in Russian Hill, you know, from when she was young, and she was paying like, I don't know, $500 a month for this, you know, studio. And so, yeah, she's going to keep it forever as her pied a terre.
and she's going to fight for it if anybody tries to take it away from her, even though she's not entitled to rent control in that circumstance. So,
yeah,
you know, it's interesting. I have a little story similar. I mean, we own a home in the city, and our next door neighbor, and I won't say where it is, but our next door neighbor bought this beautiful home 15 years ago and started to remodel it. And it's still being remodeled 15 years later. It's never been lived in. I strongly suspect, I don't know for a fact, that perhaps she has a rent-controlled apartment somewhere that she just can't get her arms around giving it up.
Right.
So we have this beautiful single-family home right next door to ours that's been sitting empty for 15 years because somebody has, you know, a rent-controlled apartment somewhere. So,
right.
That's why we have shortages of housing, because of rules like that.
Yeah, I wondered why. And, you know, I mean, and this probably isn't going to be popular, but to me, if I were to have to trade off, if I were pretend legislator for a minute, and if I were to have to trade off, I think I would, you know, give some trade-offs in the rent control department because of the things that I said, but perhaps make it where people couldn't necessarily have second homes in San Francisco, right? Like,
absolutely.
You know, because it's like, there really is a housing shortage. And a lot of these people, like, you know, sometimes I'll be selling a, you know, $3-4 million condo in a high rise. And usually those the really nice condos, oftentimes there's people, the buyers that are coming in, it's their fourth or fifth home. They plan on being there like a month out of a year.
Yeah.
And, you know, to me, I mean, you know, like, it's nice to have those people in San Francisco, but, you know, that's part of the problem, is that there really are a lot of vacant things sitting there. And then of course they don't even want to rent them part-time because of these laws. Right. So if we cut that out, to me, that seems like a better option. I
agree. I think that would be a fair trade-off in exchange for, means testing, because I think what we really need is that rich people shouldn't have rent control, and it shouldn't be a circumstance where a mom and pop landlord, maybe a senior citizen in their retirement days, is renting a single place, and the person they're renting to is making a lot more money than they are, and every month their rent is being subsidized by the landlord, who makes less than the tenant, and or even has way fewer assets than the tenant. And that is a common occurrence in San Francisco, and I don't think that was the purpose of rent control. Right.
And then you have all these buildings that they can't afford to even take care of them either, because they're not getting the proper rents. And so then they're getting run down.
I call it urban blight. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the questions I heard you say, and I just wasn't clear on. So you said that one of the unintended consequences is that rent control doesn't encourage building. But then I also thought I understood that new buildings are not subject to rent control. So what did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that is now we have, the person who is going to be the developer or the contractor who's going to be building new construction always has to be concerned that the rules that currently apply to older buildings might be rolled over and applied to them. And that's exactly what's happened.
I see.
That promise that there'd be no rent control on new construction has now been overtaken by statewide rent control, because now we only have a 15-year rolling exemption. So rather than anything built after 1979, it's anything built in the last 15 years. And every year, that the person that's 16 years old, theirs becomes subject to rent control. So under state law. So basically the promise that was given to developers and the builders of housing has not been kept, because they basically changed the rules out from under them. And I think people naturally are worried about that, and that's going to cause capital to flee California and to go elsewhere to invest where they have more certainty. And let's be clear, rent control is a huge exception throughout the United States. It doesn't happen very often. There's only a few states that have allowed it to happen. And New York, of course, is one. There's a couple others, but in most places, there's no such thing as rent control, and it's considered to be unconstitutional.
So if I am buying something that is currently tenant occupied and I want to live in it, how do I go about doing that?
You consult with an attorney, a
Of
good one.
course. Absolutely. Call you first.
Consult with an attorney, and every case is going to be, well, let's just say that there are a number of strategies that we would use depending upon the particular facts of your circumstance. And we always do a careful analysis of the tenant profile, how long the tenant has been there, what kind of an asset the tenant has in terms of how below market they are. I would generally say that trying to buy the tenant out is the prize. It's usually the best way to go. There are significant regulations in San Francisco in the process of buying out tenants. So even where you want to make a deal with a tenant, and it would seem simple enough, I'll give you some money, you'll move, you'll give up your lease, you'll give up your rent control rights, you'll waive your rights. It's not that simple anymore. It used to be pretty simple. Now we have a careful process at the rent board that has to be followed. It's a public process. The agreement has to be filed at the rent board. There are significant penalties for not doing that. So it's hard to sort of answer a general question about what I would do, because I think every case is unique, but each case, in my opinion, does require a careful analysis of what approach should be taken based upon who the tenant is, what they do, how committed they are, and how deeply rooted they are in the community. There are certain cases, and given the years I've been doing this, I can look at a tenant profile, and eight times out of 10, I can figure out whether it's going to be a problem to buy the tenant out. And I'm pretty accurate on that analysis. And I can sit down with a client for an hour over the phone, or maybe over a Zoom conference, which I think is maybe the new way of doing things now, because even when we get back into our offices, pretty easy, right? It's pretty easy way to do things.
This has changed my life.
I think it's going to change a lot of our lives, and hopefully some of it will be for the better. I mean, obviously right now it's not for the better, but my point is that it's just not that hard to find somebody knowledgeable who's been doing what we do for a while, and pay them for an hour of their time and have them do a careful analysis of what the best approach is for your particular client.
So now that the buyouts are public information, what are we seeing is an average buyout for, like, say, a Google employee that's in my rental that's been there for 3 years, and now I want to move in, or I want to sell it. Like, how much do you think I have to pay to get that guy out?
It's a hard question, but it's a question that could be it actually can't be answered by looking at the rent board data. The rent board maintains data and averages, so you can actually pull that stuff up online and find out what people are actually paying. You can't really tell who the tenant is and what the tenant profile is, because the tenant's information is all wiped out. The landlord's information is all public. The tenant's information is all confidential. But let me say that, generally speaking, the closer the rent is to market, the less that you pay. So the buyouts range anywhere from $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 on the low end, and that's really is the minimum because of what you have to pay to do an eviction, right? There's the cost of an Ellis Act or an OMI or whatever it is. So that's your base point. Has to be more than that usually, but they can go up to $300,000, $400,000 these days. Yeah, unfortunately there are people that are able to leverage their long-term tenancies that have good counsel, and there are property owners who feel it's worth paying that much. I hate it. It's sickening. It's actually nauseating when that happens, but you'll see there are people that are paying that much, unfortunately. In New York, it's millions.
Really?
Yeah.
I had a building that we sold last year, and it was a 2-unit building, and the top unit was rented by a protected tenant. And my client was also a senior and had bought it 30 years prior. When she rented it to this tenant, they were already over 60.
Wow.
I know. So, I mean, normally I think a lot of times, I don't think it's legal, right? But people probably don't rent to seniors.
I think people, generally speaking, will do their best to avoid doing that. Yes. Even though you're right, you can't discriminate in that regard. But yes, I think it's harder for people because of these laws. It makes it harder for people to, again, an unintended consequence is that people will do what they can legally to avoid renting to seniors because there are more regulations that are attached to it. Anyway, curious about how did that turn out for your senior client with her senior tenant?
Well,
did she have to pay a lot, or?
So it was an interesting process. Like, basically what happened is the tenant had written a letter saying, like, well, so they had been there for 10 years. I think their rent was $2,500. Market rate was about $6,000. And they basically calculated what it would cost for them to rent 6,000 times 10 years, the difference, and came up with $300,000 was the amount that was my client's obligation to pay, because somehow it became my client's obligation to house them for the next 10 years.
No, for the rest of her life, because that's what it would have been. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, and meanwhile, by the way, she was selling because her husband had Alzheimer's and she needed to take care of him. And this was their asset. This was their
heartbreak. It's heartbreaking to hear that, Ruth.
So there was that one. So I think they did come to a negotiation. I think it was 200 is what they settled on. But then the person downstairs was a nurse, and she said in her estoppel that she believed that she was protected because she had some disabilities. And so even though she was working full time, the people buying that felt like that was a huge red flag because there were a lot of things. So ultimately her house traded, her 2-unit building traded for much lower than it should have. She refused any sort of buyout.
Yeah.
And then afterwards she sued my client for pain and suffering.
You know, I mean, that's the battleground that we live in San Francisco. And it's, if it wasn't so absurd, you know, it would be sickening and sad. I don't even know how to describe it. I live in the middle of it. Obviously it's the life I live.
Yeah. So you see this all the time.
I become a little jaded.
Yeah.
But when I hear stories like that, it still breaks my heart, particularly when you're talking about a senior couple, and one of whom's husband has Alzheimer's, and she's just trying to do the best she can for her family. And she's also provided affordable housing for 2 families, or two important, you know, members of our community. And rather than getting a medal, she gets a lawsuit, you know, that she's giving her a medal for doing that.
Yeah. So I mean, so I see stuff like that and it makes me scared. Like, that's why I don't specialize in investment properties.
Yeah. You know, there are opportunities for people that have, you know, probably more nerve and guts than we do. But you know, to me, I go back to, why is it the responsibility of the individual small mom and pop property owner to house the people that need housing in San Francisco? Why isn't that our collective obligation as a community and as a society to find a way to provide affordable housing? And for our elected representatives, and in some ways our voters, to place that obligation, that important obligation, onto the backs of one part of the community, which happen to be the property owners, I think is a crime.
And only certain
I think it's
property
unconstitutional
owners.
too.
Yeah. So, well, I could talk to you all day about all this stuff, but I know you have better things to do. And I just really, really appreciate you taking the time to kind of walk us through some of this stuff. It's been really valuable. I know it questions on a lot of people's mind that they don't understand. And, you know, probably a lot of people's heads are spinning like, wait, what? 1960, 1978, So the bottom line is it's very complicated. You know, someone should always seek professional help. We will include in the transcript your information. You are one of the top firms in San Francisco, and I will absolutely refer my clients to you, and really, really appreciate your time.
Ruth, thank you for that. Those are very kind words. And I hope that we can maybe get back and get to the rest of the topics that we weren't able to cover with another session someday. So I'd love to do it. And I'm very honored to have been here with you this morning, and best of luck and best of health to you and your family.
Good. We'll do a part 2 then. I'll take you up on that.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruth.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.